welcome to historians.us.today. We have a special segment about the Middle Ages, and with us are Deborah, Dorothy, Doris, and Dina, 4 famous historians. First off, we have Deborah talking about knights.
Deborah, a lot of people don't really know what a knight actually is. What was a knight and what was their purpose?
A knight was a protector who was hired by a king or a rich lord who owned a castle. Being a knight in the Middle Ages was more social status than military. The rank of knight was an honor, and many knights were rich gentlemen.
Can you tell us how a regular man became a knight?
Well, normally a young boy called a squire, about 15 or 16 years old, was trained by an experienced knight. A couple of years later, they would be thrust into knighthood. The making of a knight would consist of a bath, then donned in a gold robe, silk undergarments, and gold shoes. Then the knight would appear in public, and his horse and weapons would be distributed to him. He was then put into double-woven chain mail armor that no sword could pierce.
What is the difference between a soldier and a knight?
A knight rides on a horse into battle and uses a crossbow and sword rather than a spear or poleaxe. Being a knight was an honor, and being a soldier was just considered a job. Knights also were very Christian and attacked other cities to gain control of Christian lands.
Now let's go to the way knights acted, also known as chivalry, presented by Dorothy. So Dorothy, what even is chivalry?
Well, chivalry is the honorable and courageous conduct expected of a knight. Basically, in simplified terms, it's how a knight was supposed to act.
Oh, I see. So did they have a book of rules to follow?
There was a book of rules written during that time, but they didn't ever write it into one simplified document. Instead, it was more of a moral code on how to be courageous and treat women.
He's saying it's like manners.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is.
So I'm sure right now society has placed manners onto us. How is that different from the medieval times?
Well, you see, chivalry is always evolving, and so now it's more of how to be a gentleman more than how to act on the battlefield. Now, as Miss Mathis calls it, literary foil, the opposite of the knights and their chivalrous manners, were mercenaries, brought to you by Doris. So, Doris, how do mercenaries differ from normal soldiers?
Well, a soldier is someone who serves in an army, normally to protect something, someone, or to defend some ideal. On the other hand, a mercenary fights for profit, like money or land, rather than a loyalty. And mercenaries don't always have to serve an army. Unlike soldiers, they may fight for whoever can compensate them.
Why were mercenaries so common in the Middle Ages?
Well, soldiers coming out of war usually had little money, no land, and had been trained for nothing but fighting. After a war as big as the 100 Years' War, there would usually be a great number of men who fit this description. They needed to find some kind of work. Becoming a mercenary would be fitting. Moving forward, let's talk about what knights and mercenaries even protected: castles. Starting off, could you give us just a brief summary of what a typical castle would have on the inside?
Well, in the center of the castle, there was a great hall, which was one large room where the upper workers had the privilege of living in, and that's where they slept and ate. And then other than the kitchen, the bedrooms, and the bathrooms, they would typically have a chapel, a bakery and brewery, a courtyard, and they would also have, for protection, a barbarian, which is an obstacle course for attackers. And then they would have a gatehouse, which kind of worked the same. When most people do think of castles, however, they think of drawbridges and dungeons, but those actually weren't really common.
Interesting. So you talked about gatehouses and barbarians, which brings me to my next question. How were castles protected? How did a siege work?
Well, most castles would have a garrison, which is an outpost where troops were stationed to protect. But there were many strategies in performing a siege. One common way was to surround and starve the defenders until they surrendered, but that could take months or even years. And so they could also try and do things like ram a door or climb over a castle using ladders, because the surrounding and starving method could take months. And the defenders invented loopholes, which was a small opening in the wall where they would shoot bow and arrows through. So yeah.
Continuing on, let's get straight to the point and talk about weapons, one of which is swords, by Deborah. What kinds of weapons were most popular in medieval times?
A popular weapon during the time was the crossbow. It was popular because it was easy to operate, plus knights could shoot a target from a distance. Swords were also popular because they were longer than knives and thus could reach a farther distance.
So what types of weapons were used by the hunters?
Of course, the crossbow was used most in hunting, but lances, which are basically a spear used on horseback, were also common. Sometimes women hunted and used cudgels or clubs while hunting small game.
What is an uncommon but interesting medieval weapon?
A strange-looking uncommon weapon is the lucerne hammer. We think of hammers as a tool, but this hammer truly is a weapon. It looks like a regular hammer, but has a big spike on the top, the bottom where the handle would be, and a spike where the nail-removing part of a hammer would be. It was used for smashing or puncturing armor in an attack.
Moving on to thornier times, the War of the Roses presented by Dina.
I'm just going to start with a brief explanation on what the War of the Roses is. It is a series of English civil wars from 1455 to 1485 for the control of the throne of England, fought between the House of Lancaster and the House of York.
Well, that is certainly interesting. How did the war begin?
Henry IV was king, but he was a weak leader and sometimes insane. Power-hungry nobles and kingmakers plotted behind his back. Finally, Richard York laid claim to the throne and rebelled at St. Albans on May 22, 1455.
And how did the war get its name?
It was called the War of the Roses because the white rose was the badge of the Yorks and the red rose was the badge of the Lancastrians.
How did the war end, and what was significant about it?
Well, near the end of the war, the original King of England and his family, when the war started, was dead, and Richard York's grandson, Edward V's uncle, Richard Gloucester, who was evil and had claimed the throne for himself, became Richard III. England wasn't happy when Richard III threw Edward V and his younger brother in the Tower of London and supposedly murdered them. So, Henry Tudor, representing the Lancastrian line, rebelled at the Battle of Bosworth on August 22, 1485, killing Richard III and becoming the King of England, establishing the Tudor dynasty.
Wow, that certainly was a lot of different murders.
Next, let's talk about the Crusades, a series of religious wars. However, Doris, could you go into a little more depth of what exactly the Crusades was?
Sure. As you said, the Crusades were a pattern of religious wars in the Middle Ages. It began in 1095 when the Christians of Europe tried to retake control of Jerusalem and the Holy Lands from the Muslims.
And who exactly fought in the Crusades?
Crusaders, or Franks as they would call them, would come from all over Europe. In fact, there were around 30,000 soldiers from Europe in the First Crusade. They were made up of knights, peasants, and other commoners. Some saw the army as a way to get rich and try out their fighting skills, while others saw it as a way to get into heaven.
And why exactly was Jerusalem and the Holy Land so important to these people?
Well, Jerusalem was important to many religions during this time. It was important to the Jewish people as it was the site of the original temple to God. It was important to the Muslims because it was where they believed Muhammad ascended into heaven. It was important to Christians, including the Franks, because it was where Christ was crucified and resurrected. If you think the Crusades was long, then you should hear about the 100-Year War. Here, Dina will tell you more.
Thank you. Now again, I will start with a brief explanation. Spanning for more than 117 years, the 100-Year War was a series of conflicts waged between England and France over the right to the Kingdom of France, contest for control of Normandy, the Aquitaine, and the international wool trade.
Why did the war last so long?
Well, most of the war consisted of sieges, long, tedious affairs that often dragged on for years. There was also long periods of truce and a pause in fighting with the outbreak of the bubonic plague.
What were some effects of the 100 Years' War?
Well, the culture of knights and chivalry thrived. Biographies emphasized heroic virtues and chivalrous ideas. The war inspired poems, patriotic songs, tournaments, and scholarly and historical writings about war. Pacifism, royal power, and individual liberties, but not all with effects, were good. The occasional raids that continued in France during periods of truce devastated France's economy.
Wow, that is rough.
We hope you enjoyed this segment on military life in the Middle Ages. Make sure to join us next time in the installment of the history of housewives in Egypt.